A Course in
What?
with Cynthia Morgan.
Hey, course friends. Welcome to A Course in What? I'm Cynthia Morgan, and this is a podcast in which I read and discuss the text of A Course in Miracles. And A Course in What is a free weekly podcast that comes out each Tuesday. And we are on episode number 33. And this podcast is coincidentally being released on November 11th. I don't know if you're into numerology and the whole 1111 thing or synchronicity, but I know that when you see 1111 on a clock, you're supposed to make a wish. I find it interesting that this podcast is being released on 11/11, and Tuesday, November 11th, isn't going to come around again until 2025. So not for 11 more years. There's 11 again. So let's all make a wish. And my wish will be that we're not still recording the podcast in 2025. No, that's not really my wish. It kind of is, because that would be a really long time. But anyway, we'll all make a wish that we wake up from our ego quickly and easily. Let's continue on. Let's move on to the section that we're reading. We are on chapter 3, and chapter 3 is called The Innocent Perception. We are on section 3, Perception versus Knowledge. And in podcast episode 32, the previous one, we read paragraphs 1 through 4. And today we'll finish with this section, reading paragraphs 5 through 7. And that's on page 40 in your text. So this section, you may recall from the previous episode, talks about the difference between perception and knowledge. And perception, once again, is the realm of duality. And knowledge is synonymous with heaven or non-dualism. Perception requires a body, and knowledge is attained from awakening from the dream. And because I've already defined a lot of these terms and talked about them in the last podcast episode, I don't want to sound too repetitious in this episode. So if you haven't listened to the podcast episode before this one, you might find it more helpful to go back to that podcast episode number 32 in order to more fully grasp what we're talking about in the rest of this section. Let's begin with paragraph 5, sentence 1. The Bible tells you to know yourself or to be certain. So here Jesus is telling us that to know is the same thing as being certain. There's only certainty in knowledge. All else is subject to interpretation, because it's the realm of perception or the realm of uncertainty. 2, certainty is always of God. Again, there's only one fact, and that's God and our oneness with Him. So that's the only thing that's certain. 3, when you love someone, you have perceived him as he is, and this makes it possible for you to know him. So we first need to love that person before we can know him or her. You may recall that Jesus is talking about a few different levels, so to speak, in this section. Perception, and then true perception, which is a higher perception, or true vision, and then knowledge. So perception is ego. True perception is the result of shifting our mind from fear to love. It's looking at the world through the vision of the Holy Spirit. It's still part of the dream because it's a shift or change. And there's no shifts or changes in oneness and knowledge, but it's a step in the right direction. And then that knowledge, of course, is awakening from the dream. So once you shift your perception, once you love him or her, then you can know him or her. 4, until you first perceive him as he is, you cannot know him. So until you perceive him as an innocent child of God, you can't know him. And I may have mentioned this before, but I find it helpful as I'm reading the course to substitute the name of someone that I'm holding a grievance against for these pronouns. So until you first perceive Joe as he is, you cannot know him. And that just helps to make it more personal, because Jesus is speaking to us individually, to our situations and our relationships. And even though we tend to read the course and it becomes very general, It's more helpful when you make it specific to yourself. So again, the sentence is talking about first shifting your perception about your brother. 5, while you ask questions about him, you are clearly implying that you do not know God. So this course often tells us that the only way that we can know God is through knowing our brothers at this point. It's through those specific lessons of forgiveness and having those miracles, shifting our perception about those relationships in our lives that become the tools to help us to awaken and know God. So when it says, while you ask questions about him, you are clearly implying that you do not know God. It's not that you literally ask questions about someone. It just means that while you are still uncertain of who he is, of who your brother is, you are clearly implying that you do not know God. If you knew God, you would know your brother. And if you knew your brother, you would know God. 6, certainty does not require action. Now, this is a reference to something we read in the last episode. If you look at paragraph 2, sentence 9, it says, how you perceive at any given time determines what you do, and actions must occur in time. So actions occur in time and are the result of your perception. So referring to this sentence, certainty being outside of time and space does not require action. 7, when you say you are acting on the basis of knowledge, you are really confusing knowledge with perception. So it would be more accurate to say we are acting on the basis of perception. 8, knowledge provides the strength for creative thinking, but not for right doing. So let's talk for a moment about this idea of creative thinking. You may recall that the word create or creations, creative, those are all related to the realm of knowledge. We are God's creations. God extended love and created us. So when the Course talks about creations, it's talking about the results of those extensions of love. Each time we extend love, we create. Only those creations of love, we are told in the Course, are lasting. So here he's saying knowledge provides the strength for creative thinking, but not for right doing. So that creative extension of love comes from the realm of knowledge, but not for right doing, meaning that any action, right doing, is a part of the split mind, a part of the physical world and perceptions. 9, perception, miracles, and doing are closely related. And here he's summing up all of these words that he's throwing at us, that they're all closely related because all illusions are the same. Perceptions, miracles, and doing are all part of the dream of separation. 10, knowledge is the result of revelation and induces only thought. So heaven, which is synonymous with knowledge, or oneness, is the result of breaking down those barriers of fear and guilt in our mind to that love's presence. Heaven doesn't require that we do anything or go anywhere. It's an undoing. So revelations, those direct experiences from God to us, as we've discussed, undoes those barriers, as does the miracle. I think when Jesus says it induces only thought, he's saying that there's no action involved. It's an experience in the mind. 11, even in its most spiritualized form, perception involves the body. And in paragraph 4, you may recall, he talked about those spiritual experiences, the visions of God. And no matter how holy they are, he says they don't last. Why? Because we're still stuck in the dream of separation. And that dream of separation always involves a body. 12, knowledge comes from the altar within and is timeless because it is certain. So when it says the altar within is the holy place in your mind. It's not a structure outside of yourself. It's that part of your mind that's connected to God and joined with Him. So knowledge comes from the altar within, from that holy place in your mind within, and is timeless because it is certain. 13. To perceive the truth is not the same as to know it. So we all, especially as students of A Course in Miracles, have that ability or awareness to know when we're thinking with our ego. But that doesn't mean that we don't keep choosing our ego. We can perceive the truth of a situation, but still not make the right decision. And that's because we don't know it yet. So to perceive the truth is not the same as to know it. It hasn't become our default. Paragraph 6, sentence 1. Right perception is necessary before God can communicate directly to His altars, which He established in His Son. So right perception is another way of saying true perception. And you can see why this course requires study. It's, on one hand, really simple and repetitious, and on the other hand, it makes you have to sit back and to think and really study. He uses a lot of different terms for the same idea. So again, the altar is that holy part of our mind. So right perception is really a loving perception. A loving perception is necessary before God can communicate directly to our minds. And why is that? Because fear is a block to God. That guilt is a block to God. It's not that we're waiting on God to communicate directly to us, but rather that God is waiting for us to let go of that fear, to undo the guilt, so that His love just shines through our mind. Like the sun that's always shining. It's just there waiting for the clouds to pass. The fear is the cloud in the way, but once that fear dissipates, the sun just shines upon us. 2. There He can communicate His certainty, and His knowledge will bring peace without question. So with that sun shining upon us, there will be no clouds, no fear, no separation, no questions. That oneness will bring peace without question. Questioning is always an attribute of the ego. 3. God is not a stranger to His sons, and His sons are not strangers to each other. Jesus is asking us to be to our brothers as God is to us. He's not a stranger. He looks upon us as His son, as a holy part of Him. And therefore, we should look at each other and everything, all animals and plants is the same, that we're all connected. There's a holiness and a oneness within all of us. Because as one of the workbook lessons says, holiness is in everything because holiness is in our mind. And again, we're not making the physical holy. I think that's an important distinction. The physical world is an illusion. Rather, we're recognizing, we're using a different set of eyes, so to speak, to recognize the spirit behind the physical, which is very holy. And when he says God is not a stranger to His sons, and His sons are not strangers to each other, when we think of the word stranger, we think of someone that we don't know. And when he's saying He's not a stranger to you, that's implying that we already know this person. It's just that we forgot that we knew this person. 4. Knowledge preceded both perception and time and will ultimately replace them. So oneness or knowledge or heaven, that's our original state. The Course says that into eternity where all is one, there crept a tiny mad idea. So in this eternity of oneness, this heaven, this idea of separation occurred. And that oneness is our only real state. We will eventually return there. Just as we are aware of our bed when we go to sleep and then dream and then wake up from that sleep back in bed again. We will go back to that original state. 5. That is the real meaning of Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end. And before Abraham was I am. Alpha and Omega are the first and last letters of the Greek alphabet, and they've been used by Christianity to say that Jesus said, I am Alpha and the Omega. The phrase is used to mean that Jesus existed forever, Jesus and God. And this idea before Abraham was I am is also another way of saying that God and Jesus existed always. And that's how Christianity looks at it. But he's saying the real meaning is that knowledge preceded both perception and time. And that knowledge, that oneness, will ultimately replace this dream of separation. 6. Perception can and must be stabilized, but knowledge is stable. Perception can be stabilized by us by our choice to forego our ego in those moments and choose love instead. And he's saying it must be stabilized. It can and it must. We must choose love. Again, this is a required course, but knowledge is and always will be stable because it's consistent. And again, for those that are just jumping in and don't know anything about the course and are thinking that I mean to say that A Course in Miracles is a required course, I'm just referencing earlier podcast episodes in that waking up is required of all of us. 7. Fear God and keep his commandments becomes know God and accept his certainty. And that's a much more beautiful way of putting it, to know God through our brother and accept his certainty, accept the truth that has never changed. Paragraph 7. If you attack error in another, you will hurt yourself. So in this paragraph, Jesus is instructing us to perceive the truth in ourselves, once again, by perceiving it in another. So what does it mean to attack error in another? It means to see their errors as real. And if you do that, you are attacking him because you are defending the separation over God. When you attack another, you always hurt yourself because you have first bought into the illusion of yourself as being separate in order to buy into the illusion of another. So by attacking another, you're sustaining your own guilt and separation. You're just keeping yourself stuck in time. Now, this doesn't mean that you don't see that people do make mistakes. They do. But your mistake is always seeing them through your ego. It's not about denial, as I've said over and over again, as well as Jesus says in his course. It's about looking beyond the mistake and perceiving the truth in them. And as we said in an earlier podcast, it's about having confidence in your brother that he or she will make a right-minded decision instead of a wrong-minded decision. 2, you cannot know your brother when you attack him. You first have to love your brother by remembering the truth about him before you can know him, before you can join in that oneness with him. And how do you love your brother? You first have to have the willingness to want to see him differently, to forego that ego interpretation of the relationship or the situation. 3, attack is always made upon a stranger. If you're attacking someone, it's because you don't remember him or her. And if you don't remember that person, it's because you don't remember yourself. You don't remember your truth. 4, you are making him a stranger by misperceiving him, and so you cannot know him. Okay, I think we just talked about that. 5, it is because you have made him a stranger that you are afraid of him. So what we see as outside of ourselves always becomes fearful to the ego. The ego would tell us that that's not us. That thing is separate from us, so it has the power to hurt us in some way. 6, perceive him correctly so that you can know him. And again, Ask for a miracle. Ask to have your perception cleansed and see through the vision of the Holy Spirit. Perceive him correctly. That always means with the vision of the Holy Spirit, so that you can know him. 7, there are no strangers in God's creation. How can there be strangers in oneness, right? 8, to create as he created, you can create only what you know and therefore accept as yours. So here's that idea of creating, extending love as he extended love. It's referencing that idea that in order to receive, we have to give, that giving and receiving are the same. 9, God knows his children with perfect certainty because God doesn't have a split mind. 10, he created them by knowing them. He can only create from a mind that knows its truth. We can only create from a mind that is filled with love. 11, he recognizes them perfectly. Again, he knows who they are. 12, when they do not recognize each other, they do not recognize him. When we don't recognize those outside of ourselves, everyone and everything, as one with us, then we can't know God, because everyone and everything is a split off part of God. Everyone and everything contains holiness. Again, I'm not talking about the physical, I'm talking about beyond the physical eyes. So how can we reject that holiness and know God? We can't. We have to begin to see that holiness in others. Then we will know it in ourselves. And then we will know God. So this week, we will practice perceiving the holiness in all of our brothers, human and non-human, in every living thing. We'll try to see beyond the physical, what our physical eyes lie to us and tell us is true, and rather see through that vision of the Holy Spirit. And we will stop there for today. Thank you so much for joining me. And if you would like to stay in touch, we have a Facebook page just for this podcast. It's facebook.com/A Course in What if you're on Facebook. And I also have a hypnotherapy page on Facebook /Cynthia Morgan Hypnotherapy. And you can contact me through Facebook. If you're not on Facebook, I'm also on Twitter at Cynthia S. Morgan. And you can visit my website if you're not on Twitter or Facebook, cynthiamorgan.us. And you can contact me through that as well. So if you would like to say the summary of A Course in Miracles with me, that would be great. Nothing real can be threatened. Nothing unreal exists. Herein lies the peace of God.